All right, guys, let's go ahead and get started with the Civil War Part 3. So we talked about Abraham Lincoln at the end of Part 2. Let's move on to his counterpart in the Confederacy in the South, a man named Jefferson Davis, who was the only president of the Confederate States of America from 1861 to 1865. He did have a military background. He graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Prior to secession, he was a U.S. Senator for many years from the state of Mississippi. That's where he's from. He also served for a time as a U.S. Secretary of War, and he's going to appoint Robert E. Lee as the General-in-Chief of the Confederate armies. Now let's talk about some of those generals. Ulysses S. Grant on the Union side. He was not the first commander-in-chief of the Union armies. There were several that came before him, but they proved to be incompetent and not up to the job. So eventually Abraham Lincoln is going to settle on Ulysses S. Grant, who was also a graduate from the U.S. Military Academy in West Point. He won really the first major Union victories of the war. He was responsible for leading troops into battle and capturing control of the Mississippi River in the siege of Vicksburg, which was a major strategic goal of the Union with the Anaconda Plan. They wanted to cut the Confederacy in half by occupying the Mississippi River, and he helped accomplish that. Lincoln did appoint him commanding general of the Union armies, and he is the general that will accept the surrender of General Lee that will end the Civil War at Appomattox Courthouse. On the other side, you have Robert E. Lee from Virginia. That was the commander-in-chief of the Confederate forces. There were many other generals, but he was the lead commander. He fought many larger Union armies to standoffs in different battles, but particularly at Antietam when the Union forces outnumbered the Confederate forces basically 2-1. The Confederates did not win the Battle of Antietam, but they didn't lose it. It was kind of a standoff, and you consider how badly they were outnumbered. That was a great military victory for them. Unfortunately, Robert E. Lee, for him and the Confederacy, he was defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg, which was his second attempt to take the attack into the North, to take the war into the North. It's a 3-day battle. It looked like it might go their way for a while, but in the end, they ended up losing, and the Battle of Gettysburg was the last time the Southerners are going to make an offensive into the North, kind of the turning point of the war. And then he will, of course, surrender to General Grant to end the Civil War at Appomattox Courthouse. Both Grant and Lee had two trusted sidekicks that were generals that were kind of like their right-hand men. For Grant, it was William Tecumseh Sherman, who we talked about briefly before with the Atlanta campaign. He was a general that occupied Atlanta and then went on his very infamous march to the sea, burning everything in its path on the way from Atlanta to Savannah. He was also a graduate from the U.S. Military Academy. And he served under General Grant during the siege of Vicksburg, where they captured the Mississippi River, in addition to his efforts in Atlanta. Then you have Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who some might say was even more important to the South in their military campaign than Robert E. Lee was while he was alive. Thomas Stonewall Jackson did graduate from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, like most of the other generals here. He got his nickname Stonewall when he was general that won the first Battle of Bull Run. There were soldiers that were shouting, "Hey, there's General Jackson, stand like a stone wall," keeping a line between the Confederate and the Union troops. So that name kind of stuck with him. He fought under General Lee at many other battles, including Antietam and the Second Bull Run. Unfortunately, he very tragically loses his life at the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia, where after playing one of the decisive roles in the victory, basically coming up from behind the Union troops and inflicting heavy casualties on them. After the battle is over, he and some of his troops go into the forest to kind of scout ahead, and they were mistaken as Union soldiers by a regiment from North Carolina. They opened fire. Stonewall Jackson was shot basically right in the shoulder. They had to amputate the arm almost immediately. They thought he might recover there for a while. It was like he was on the up and up, even though he had lost an arm, but he contracts pneumonia and ends up dying very tragically at the age of 39. So a very, very tough pill to swallow for the Confederate forces. He was a military genius. All right, now let's go ahead and talk briefly about what was going on in the North and in the South, the home front during this war in both countries, the USA and the Confederate States. The North was very divided during the majority of the war. As the number of deaths grew, opposition to the war throughout the entire North is going to grow, and they are very upset with how Lincoln was handling the war. They thought this should have been an easy victory for the North. It should not have lasted near as long as it was lasting. In fact, early on in the war, in the first battles of the war, people would come and actually picnic on top of hills and watch the battles take place. They thought it was just going to be a quick little war, pretty decisive victory for the North, and be over before you know it. Quickly, they're disabused of that notion, and as a number of casualties start to grow, opposition to the war is going to grow, and opposition to Abraham Lincoln is also going to grow. Lincoln, on top of the public opinion that was turning against him, he had to deal with Northern Democrats who supported the war but opposed Lincoln primarily because of how he was handling the war. But you also had, on the other hand, peace Democrats and what they called Copperheads who were opposed to the war and wanted peace. To deal with those people who were constantly saying this war needs to be over, we want to go ahead and have peace, let the South be free, let them do what they want to do, we'll keep the states that we have, and everyone will be happy. Well, Lincoln felt that they were kind of undermining the war effort. So many of those peace Democrats and Copperheads, they were seized. They were basically arrested without a warrant, and they were held for long periods of time without a trial. This is, again, Lincoln suspending habeas corpus, the right to go in front of a jury and a judge and have a trial when you're accused of a crime, not just be held indefinitely. So he's taking some pretty dramatic and pretty controversial steps to keep the peace in the North, but this is clearly going to divide people within the United States of America. Lincoln was ultimately able to keep the North in the fight and keep them dedicated to fighting the Civil War. It took some statesmanship, but ultimately he sees it through, although there were some times where it seemed like that might not be the case. And then in 1863, he instituted a very controversial act, which we call the Conscription Act of 1863. Conscription means that you are basically drafting citizens into the military against their will. And what this did, this act made all men between the ages of 20 and 45 liable for military service. But you could get out of it if you had enough money to pay a $300 fee, or if you found someone that would be willing to take your place. So this has made a lot of people very upset because basically you're saying poor people are going to be fighting a rich man's war. Because if you're rich at $300 could hire someone to replace you for less than $300, well, then you didn't have to fight. So the poor people were the ones fighting. So this was a very controversial measure by Lincoln. And because of the Conscription Act of 1863, riots break out all over the place, particularly in New York City. A primarily Irish-American mob attacks African-Americans and wealthy whites. Because remember, the poor people now turning against the rich people. And 117 people were killed before federal troops come in and are able to temporarily suspend the draft order. But eventually, that draft order is restored. And oddly enough, you would think a war is usually they're so expensive. Usually, it hurts. It's something that's not good for a country economically. You should spend so much money fighting the war. But this war actually ends up helping the northern economy because it created even more jobs for people who were needed to help fight the war, manufacturing to help support the troops in the field. So it actually ends up helping the northern economy, helping them grow somewhat. In the South, the home front was a little different. The war absolutely destroyed the plantation economy. I said a little bit earlier that the majority of the war was fought in the South. So if all the war is fought in the South, then you're going to see a massive level of destruction, particularly in a state like Georgia, where Sherman goes on his march to the sea, where he burns everything in his path from Atlanta to Savannah. And this loss of people, the loss of life in the South, is draining the southern farms of labor. If you don't have people there to work on the southern farms, then not as much is getting produced. If not as much is getting produced, then there's not as much money being made, which is, of course, terrible for the economy. As the Union came down south, they started to conquer more and more territory as the war progressed. They started to confiscate land, to take land from Southerners. And when they take the land, well, the cotton production is going to decline. If cotton production declines, the South is going to be really in trouble economically. The blockade also prevented the South. Remember, the Union Army with their Navy, they are, I should say, the Union military with their Navy, they have blockaded the South all around the different ports, and that's preventing the South from being able to get food and other essential items to fight this war from European countries, which is going to lead to major shortages in the South because they cannot produce everything they need by themselves. You're going to see riots in the South as well. These riots are a little bit different than the riots you see up north because the riots here are concerning shortages by people who were basically starving them. They're being starved to death because of all the issues that were going on in the South. Most of the war being fought there, the Union Army confiscating land, not being able to get foodstuffs from Europe and other essential items. So these are some major problems the Confederacy is going to have to face. The diplomatic side of this also bears mentioning as well. Remember, one of the things that the Union was trying to keep the South from doing is basically keeping them from setting up an alliance between themselves and Britain and France. They want to keep Britain from joining the Confederacy cause. Even though Britain had economic ties to the South. Think about it. Britain, with all their factories, the Industrial Revolution, they have all these factories, that's great, but they need raw materials, particularly things like cotton, and their primary trading partner in getting those raw materials was the American South. So Britain has some economic ties to the South, so the South really thought there was a good chance Britain might come and support them in this war so that they would still maintain access to the South's raw materials. But Lincoln changes the game when he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. With the Emancipation Proclamation, what Abraham Lincoln did is he declared once and for all that slaves in the rebellious states were now free. He didn't say in the states everywhere, because think about it, we have some of the border states, right? You have Missouri, you have Kentucky, you have Maryland, you have Delaware that are slave states, but they're fighting on the side of the North during the Civil War. So he's saying all the slaves in the states that are rebelling, basically the 11 states in the Confederacy, those slaves are now free. But think about this in reality. That's not actually going to free anyone, because the Southerners do not recognize Abraham Lincoln as their president. They do not recognize the laws of the United States as laws that they must follow. They feel like they have their own country. So they're not going to follow this law. So it doesn't actually free anyone. So what it actually did, though, is it reframed the war. Up until this point, January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln had maintained that this war was all about preserving the Union, keeping the United States together. But now he's saying this war is not just about preserving the Union. That's part of it still, but it's also about ending slavery. If the North wins, they will outlaw slavery. So what this basically does is it makes the North look like the good guys to all the foreign countries. That's why when you look back and study history now, almost all history books are going to make the USA in the Civil War look like the good guys because they were fighting in slavery, right? Well, Britain had outlawed slavery in the 1830s. So now that Lincoln is saying this war is about slavery, whoever wins this war is going to be able to impose their will on the issue of slavery. Now Britain really can't support the South, even if they need to economically, because Britain felt it was wrong to support the South in their attempt to preserve slavery. If Lincoln would have kept saying the war was just about to preserve the Union, there's a good chance Britain would have come in and helped the South and formed an alliance with them. But now that he makes it about slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation, now the British will not come help the Southerners. And that is ultimately what does the South in. Let's look at the soldier perspective here. Most perspectives in the war early on is that God would reward the side that had the most valor, who showed the most bravery, showed the most courage in battle. And they also most soldiers saw this as an opportunity to prove their valor, to prove their courage and their manliness. So most soldiers in this time, most men, especially in the South, they wanted to fight. They knew that they were risking their lives in doing something. It was dangerous to go fight this war. But they thought this was an opportunity to prove how courageous and how manly you were. And if you chose not to fight, if you ran away, you were a coward. And people's reputation of them meant everything. Their name was everything. So they were going to jump at an opportunity to defend their way of life and defend their country. They also believed at this time that war was going to be civilized, very gentlemanly, still kind of in some ways harkening back to the Revolutionary era. But quickly, the realities of war became pretty clear. Disease was rampant. So twice as many soldiers actually ended up dying from disease than dying from wounds from battle. So that's a tough reality. There's a general lack of medical care. They didn't really have the ability to deal with thousands of battle wounded. I mean, think about Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson gets shot in the shoulder. Should not have been a fatal wound, but because they did not have advanced medical care, he ends up dying. They had to cut his arm off, had to amputate it. They don't really treat it that well. He ends up getting pneumonia and he dies. So the medical care was pretty horrific. Camp life was dreadful, so even when you weren't fighting, just staying in camp with the troops, the food was disgusting, particularly in the South, because they were short on food, so they had to get creative what they were making, and it wasn't really very nutritious. Sanitation was terrible. It was a very boring life. You're either fighting a battle or just marching, kind of camping out. So pretty early on in the war, they realized that this is not what they thought it was going to be, this kind of romanticized view of the war, this gentlemanly war. It's not really what it's like. It's pretty terrible. And over time, the tactics of the soldiers are going to change as well. Gradually, in the face of reality, the battle tactics do change. Frontal assault at first was thought to be courageous. Remember, the soldiers thought this was a chance to prove how brave and how courageous they were. So they thought just riding straight into battle on a frontal assault would be the way to go. But by the end of the war, that was considered to be a suicide job. So soldiers begin to try to change how this war is fought. They start to dig trenches. They defend against better rifles and cannon fire with the trenches. The war also becomes more guerrilla-like, where you start moving from point to point with cover, where you're not just kind of standing right in front of your enemy opening fire. You're trying to be deceptive about it. You're trying to hide, sneak attacks, hit and run type attacks. And ultimately the war ends in this idea of total war, where you just want to destroy everything in the path, not just military stuff, but